Welcome, everyone. If you can take your seats so we can get started, that would be fantastic. First, I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Daniel H. Brush chapter of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm Elizabeth Caston. I'm the regent of our chapter. And we have been very lucky for I've lost count on how many years that Darrel has been willing to give a presentation on behalf of usually with our chapter and the library as well. Every presentation that I have been at has been different and very informative. So today he will be talking about the famous and infamous people that have passed through Cairo, Illinois. So without further ado, Mr. Darrel Dexter.
Thank you. And I always appreciate the invitation from Carbondale Public Library and the Daniel Brush chapter of the DAR. And it has kind of become a tradition. Almost every February for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been here and given presentations, and I always look forward to it. And they've asked me next year if I will come back. So I'll be here next year. I hope you will. I don't know what the topic will be, but hopefully it'll be one that's interesting to all of you. When I first made the PowerPoint and sent out the information for a flyer, I titled it Famous and Infamous Visitors to Cairo. And of course, infamous means someone that's well known, but well known for bad deeds or deeds that aren't acceptable, let's say. And I have a list of about 75 people that are famous that came through Cairo. And I know even as much as all of you love history, you probably didn't want to sit there and listen to me talk about 75 or 80 different individuals that came through Cairo. So I limited it to about 30. You're welcome. And when I cut the list, the two people that fell into the infamous category, that would be Frank James, brother of Jesse James, and Cole Younger, who also was a part of that gang, they got cut. So I really don't consider any of the people that I'm talking about today to be infamous. But you're all adults. You can decide for yourself. The people that I talk about, if you appreciate the deeds and accomplishments in their life, you might call them famous. If not, you may put them in the infamous category. Cairo, Illinois is where I was born. So I have a special connection to Cairo, Illinois. Cairo is also unique in that it's situated right at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, where the two rivers come together. And that's one of the things that makes Cairo so important. And today, Cairo has a population of about 1,700 people, but at its peak in 1920, it had over 15,000 people. All the people that I'm going to talk about this morning, I think you'll recognize them because all of them, and I checked, can be found in a typical U.S. high school history textbook. So I know there are some high school history teachers here, so you will recognize these people for sure. And I think most of the rest of you will as well. The way I have this set up, I expect it to be very informal. The way I have it set up is when we begin, the slide will show the picture of the person that I'm going to briefly talk about. And you'll have an opportunity about 3 or 4 seconds to look at that picture and see if you recognize that person. I'm starting off with the 10 presidents that visited Cairo, Illinois, and then some of the major presidential candidates that visited. And the first one's going to be very easy. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll go back to that. I think you recognize Abraham Lincoln, 16th president of the United States. Of course, he served during the Civil War. But unless you've read one of the biographies of Abraham Lincoln, you may not understand or realize that as a young man, he was only 19 years old in 1828. He made a trip on a flatboat down the Sangamon River, down the Mississippi River, all the way to New Orleans. And one of the biographers of Lincoln said that when they got to New Orleans, that Abraham Lincoln, viewed a slave auction where people that were enslaved were being sold. And the impact that that had on Lincoln was he learned to hate slavery. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he once said, I hate slavery as much as any abolitionist. Now, as he was going down the Mississippi River, he would have passed the confluence. And in 1828, that first year he made his first trip, actually he made another one in 1831, but in 1828, a man named William Byrd, and as well as the people that he enslaved, built the first building in Cairo, Illinois. And they built a tavern first, and then they built a storehouse. And that began to attract people. People were attracted to the confluence anyway, because it's just a neat spot. If you ever go to Cairo, go down to the river, and you can see where the Mississippi and Ohio rivers come together. When I was a kid, I took my first trip there, and it was amazing because the Ohio River was so blue and the Mississippi River was brown. And where the two mixed together, it was just amazing. Now you go down there, and unfortunately, the Ohio River is just as brown as the Mississippi. It's still impressive. It's not documented, but it's likely Abraham Lincoln, on his trips on flatboats, would have stopped at Cairo, Illinois. Hopefully you recognize this guy, still living, born in 1961. This is Barack Obama. He was a U.S. Senator from Illinois and then the 44th president of the United States. He visited Cairo in 2006 while he was a U.S. Senator, and he made a big announcement about new jobs that were coming to Cairo and expansion of Bunge Corporation, which is right on the river and the largest employer in Cairo, Illinois. And those jobs were supposed to come from an expansion of biodiesel. I don't know that those jobs ever came in the great numbers that were promised, but he came to Cairo in 2006. Probably recognize him. This is William Jefferson Clinton, or better known as Bill Clinton. He was the governor of Arkansas and then became the 42nd president of the United States. He did serve during the longest economic expansion in American history, but his affair with Monica Lewinsky, you can probably remember that, did mar his presidency. He came to Cairo August 30th, 1996 on a bus caravan. He was campaigning for his second term as president of the United States. The person most associated with Cairo, the most famous person associated with Cairo, is this man. And actually, this photograph was taken in Cairo, Illinois. And this is Ulysses S. Grant. He had this very long beard that he grew, and he had the picture taken. And then his wife showed up in Cairo, and she stayed with him in Cairo for quite a while. And she suggested that he either shave the beard or at least trim it. So it's not really clear here, but his beard went way down. And he kind of cleaned it up a little bit after his wife arrived in Cairo. He was in command of Fort Defiance in Cairo from September 4th, 1861. That's when he arrived. And then, of course, he launched with the troops accumulated there at Cairo an invasion of the South just a few months later. His headquarters were famously at the St. Charles Hotel, which was a luxury hotel. As a matter of fact, they said the St. Charles Hotel was the nicest hotel in Illinois outside of the Palmer House in Chicago at the time. It was a nice hotel. The thing of it is, if you look at the records that Grant left behind, he states very clearly he only lived there a week. He was only in the hotel for a week, and then he moved into the bank building. And he wrote his wife, Julia. It was in the City National Bank, which was right on the Ohio levee. He wrote his wife, Julia. He said, Cairo's not half so unpleasant a place as I supposed it would be. I have a nice office, and I live with members of my staff immediately back of it. The Civil War is what made Grant famous. He was a war hero. And as we'll see with a lot of these people, the war hero kind of catapults people into the White House if that's something that they want. And Ulysses S. Grant visited Cairo. He was the 18th president. He visited Cairo again in 1880. And he came in by train, and they had a big reception for him at Magnolia Manor. The Gallagher family owned it at that time, and all the local bigwigs were invited. They had a reception for President Grant. He did stay the night there, but they also had a gala ball at the St. Charles Hotel. So those of you that have visited Magnolia Manor, you know there's not really a ballroom. So they had the ball for him with fireworks at the St. Charles. When he was here, he made a speech, of course, and he said this in his speech in 1880. He said, when I last was with you, my friends, your little city was a camp of bristling bayonets. You are now in the full enjoyment of pursuits of peace, a thrifty, promising little city. And this man, you probably recognize him. He's on Mount Rushmore, one of the four. This is Theodore or Teddy Roosevelt, who was the 26th president of the United States. He also stands out for several reasons. One is he is the youngest person to ever serve as president of the United States. And I used to teach high school history. And I've always had students that wanted to say, oh, no, Kennedy was the youngest. John F. Kennedy was the youngest elected president. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest to ever serve as president. He became president after McKinley was assassinated. He's also famous, and this is really what catapulted him into the White House. He's famous for being at the head of the Rough Riders in a charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. Textbooks have added to that. Recent textbooks have concluded that he would not have been successful charging up San Juan Hill if it hadn't been for about 1,200 Black volunteers who actually fought their way to the top and cleared the way for Roosevelt to get to the top. He also is the first president to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he came to Cairo on a steamer called the Mississippi. He arrived at the riverfront October 3rd, 2007. And then he was taken by a carriage pulled by horses to St. Mary's Park. in Cairo. The headline of the Cairo newspaper on the day he visited said, "President Roosevelt gorgeously received most impressive event in Cairo history." What brought him to Cairo was there was a push to invest in the Mississippi River and the waterways because people were going to trains to move produce and transportation, and river traffic had really fallen back. And so he believed if people would invest in river traffic, that the river traffic would pick up. This is a controversial one for some people. They would put him in the famous category, others might say infamous. This is the 7th president of the United States, Andrew Jackson. Ironically, when I researched Andrew Jackson, he's often called the president that pushed America further towards democracy, which is kind of ironic when you think about it, because he was a slaveholder and he's well known for being the president that really pushed for Indian removal in 1832. So what I think they must mean when they say that he pushed America further towards democracy is that while he was president during that time, sometimes called the era of the common man, more poor white men were able to vote and participate in government. During the War of 1812, he was commander of the Tennessee militia, and it was at that time in 1813 he had about 1,500 soldiers that stopped at the confluence. There was no settlement there, no Cairo there, no tavern built yet in 1813. But he led the soldiers on flatboats to the confluence, and then they stopped at the site of Cairo. And they had to stay there for about 3 days because of ice on the Mississippi River. So they were stalled on the river the same way the Cherokee would be stalled on the river in Union County in 1838 and 39. Jackson was stalled on the river with his soldiers for about 3 days. Recognize this one? That's Taft, yes. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was the 27th U.S. president and the only president to also serve as Chief Justice later of the U.S. Supreme Court. He served on the court from 1921 to 1930. What fascinates kids about William Howard Taft is he's the only president to ever get stuck in the White House bathtub. He weighed like 330 pounds, and he got in the bathtub and couldn't get out. And different accounts, I've seen pictures of 3 plumbers that were called in to help get him out, and other accounts say 6 White House aides, and they actually had to grease his sides to get him to slide out of the bathtub. That's probably what my students would remember about William Howard Taft. But he visited Cairo on the steamboat, the Oleander, and 25,000 people showed up at the waterfront. When the boat stopped, 25,000 people, not all from Cairo, but surrounding areas, came to see William Howard Taft. And what surprises me about this visit was that on the steamboat, there was the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, 100 members of Congress, and 25 governors. And even Taft, when he addressed the crowd, said, just think what would happen to this country if there was a tragedy and all of them were killed or lost. This is what Taft said, and he also was here in Cairo on a visit to promote investment in Mississippi River traffic. He said this, he said, "And I can only ask you to accept from me as an evidence of my gratitude for my pleasure over this welcome, my heartfelt thanks and my wish for the growth and prosperity of Cairo, to that which she deserves, situated at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi River." He spoke at the same spot where Roosevelt spoke and the same spot from which Grant left Cairo on the Ohio River. Less well known, he is known by many historians, voted one of the worst presidents, one of the top 5 worst presidents of all times. This is Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson became the 17th president of the United States after the assassination of President Lincoln. And he's seen as among the worst presidents for a couple reasons. One is he stood in very solid opposition to civil rights gains, opposition to the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. And he's seen by presidential historians as a president unwilling to compromise or work with Congress. And that puts him on among the worst from presidential historians, the worst list. There was a man named Captain William Williams who lived in Cairo for decades. And he said this, he said, "Andrew Johnson was always a friend of Cairo, and he fully appreciated the courtesies he had often received from the people of Cairo." So this was written in 1911 by Mr. Williams in basically an article, Famous People I Have Met. So he leaves us with the impression that President Johnson often came to Cairo. I'll talk later about why some of these people would go to Cairo. This is, when I say the name, Zachary Taylor. President Zachary Taylor was the 12th president of the United States. He died in office in 1850. Matter of fact, there was such a conspiracy talk about Zachary Taylor because officially Zachary Taylor ate a bunch of cherries and drank a glass of milk, and the indigestion is what's listed as the cause of death. And people kind of question that, and they actually exhumed his body to see, because people said he had to have been poisoned, and they found no poison in his system. I don't know that eating cherries and drinking milk is going to cause you to die, but he wasn't poisoned. If he was, there was no evidence of that in his body. He was the general during the Mexican-American War, and once again, that war, being a war hero, kind of catapulted him into the White House. He arrived in Cairo on February 6, 1849, and he arrived after he was elected, but he was on his way to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. And he stopped just briefly. Actually, it was 3 o'clock in the morning when his boat pulled into Cairo, and they fired the cannon and did the salutes and a serenade. Whether he appreciated that at 3 o'clock in the morning or not, I'm not sure. This is another president, not one of the more famous ones, but this is James Garfield. And James Garfield was the 20th president of the United States. He served in 1881, and then he was assassinated in the same year he was inaugurated. That's usually what people know about Garfield, was that he was president and was assassinated. He was a Union general during the Civil War from Ohio. And then he served in Congress from 1863 to 1880. And it was during that time that he visited Cairo in 1868. It's not mentioned in any newspapers. The History of Cairo by Lansdowne said he was a visitor to Cairo. This one I haven't been able to document from newspaper accounts. More recognizable, you might love her or hate her, depending on your views. But Hillary Clinton was the first lady of the United States when her husband, Bill Clinton, was president. She was a U.S. Senator from New York and then U.S. Secretary of State from 2009 to 2013. In researching Hillary Clinton, one of the interesting things that I found out was that in 1964, she was a Goldwater girl. I'll talk more about who Barry Goldwater was, but she was a Goldwater girl whenever Barry Goldwater, very right-wing conservative candidate for president, she was very conservative in her youth. And they had a special outfit the Goldwater girls dressed up in, and she appeared in Arkansas at rallies for Barry Goldwater. She was a presidential candidate in 2016, and even though she received 2.9 million more votes than her opponent, she didn't get the votes in the Electoral College that was needed. So she didn't become president. She came to Cairo with her husband, Bill Clinton, in 1996. Another tough one. This is Stephen A. Douglas. I'm sure you recognize the name. Sometimes called the Little Giant. He was a senator from Illinois from 1847 to 1861. He was a presidential contender. He wanted to be president bad. And he ran in 1852 and didn't get his party's nomination. He ran again in 1856, didn't get his party's nomination. 1860, he got the Democrat Party's nomination, or at least the Northern Democrat Party's nomination. He was invited to Cairo, and he actually passed through Cairo in 1855, but pretty much just waved at the people as he got on a steamboat and left town. But in 1858, when the Lincoln-Douglas debates were held in Jonesboro, they sent Stephen A. Douglas a special invitation to come to Cairo. And they gave him a ball, a parade, there were speeches. They had a big ball at what's called the Taylor House, which was a nice hotel in Cairo. And his wife, who was a niece of Dolly Madison, by the way, but his wife stayed down and danced with all the men, and he went upstairs, excused himself, said, I need to get my rest and prepare for tomorrow's debate, which was in Jonesboro. His last known visit to Cairo was in November of 1858, and he came to Cairo. The steamboat pulled into Cairo. People knew he was on it. They fired the cannon. People came out and serenaded him. And his wife came out and said, sorry, but my husband is not well. He's too hoarse to speak. And he wanted me to thank you for serenading and the cannons and all the celebration, but he's not able to speak. He died in 1861 of throat cancer. And I've always wondered or suspected if this hoarseness was from maybe just giving so many speeches, or if it was an early sign of throat cancer that he was dealing with. Al Gore also came in 1996 with President Clinton and Hillary Clinton. He was a presidential candidate in 2000. He also won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College vote. He got more votes than his opponent, 540,000 more. It was a very close race, but he got more votes, but didn't get the Electoral College win. George B. McClellan. He visited Cairo the same time Stephen A. Douglas came on invitation. He was a friend, close friend of Douglas. He was on the boat with Douglas. They came down from St. Louis, got off at Cairo. McClellan was vice president of the Illinois Central Railroad. And in June of 1858, he went to Cairo to inspect the levees. And he was in Cairo when the levee broke. And a man came riding through Cairo on horseback yelling, "Run for your lives, the levee's broken." And the water just rushed into Cairo. I think the only time after the levees were built that Cairo ever flooded. Didn't flood in 13, 12, 37, 93, on and on. But it flooded in 1858. I've also always speculated that the Jonesboro debate would have actually been held in Cairo if it hadn't been for the levee breaking and the flood in Cairo. He also, of course, was a Union general during the Civil War, and he had the military command of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And he made several inspection tours of the camp in Cairo, Illinois, while he was the commander. John C. Fremont, known as the Pathfinder, he visited Cairo from August 5th, 1861 to November 6, 1861. He was the first United States Senator from California, first Republican candidate for president in 1856, and he lost the election to James Buchanan. He was a Union general, also stationed in Cairo during the Civil War, and he is the person that appointed Colonel Ulysses S. Grant as commander of the Cairo post. You might recognize him if you know about the Trail of Tears. This is General Winfield Scott. And Winfield Scott was known as Old Fuss and Feathers because he really said you have to follow the book in the military. He was the commanding general of the U.S. Army from 1841 to 1861, the top general. And he is the person that President Jackson ordered to go into Cherokee land, round up the Cherokee, and remove them to Indian Territory in 1838. He ran for president as a Whig in 1852 and was defeated by Franklin Pierce. Another interesting thing about Winfield Scott, he was the person who came up with and advised President Lincoln to accept the Anaconda Plan, which was the military strategy to defeat the Confederate States. This is the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a civil rights leader. He is among the people that was with Dr. Martin Luther King when he was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. In 1968, he founded what's known as the Rainbow Coalition, and he ran for president in 1984 and in 1988. Didn't get the Democrat Party's nomination, but he was a candidate. He visited Cairo on June 17, 1969, and led a march against hunger from Cairo City Hall in Cairo to Pyramid Courts, which was a housing project in Cairo. He stayed in Cairo for several days, and spoke at a rally at Ward Chapel AME Church in 1969. I talked about this guy or mentioned this guy earlier. This is Barry Goldwater. He was a senator from the state of Arizona, a strong opponent to New Deal legislation, as well as a strong opponent to labor unions. He was responsible, however, he has a bad civil rights record, but he was responsible for desegregating the Senate cafeteria. There was a black woman who was on his personal staff, and she could not eat in the U.S. Senate cafeteria. And he led the efforts to desegregate and let everybody who wanted to eat at the Senate cafeteria. He came campaigning for President of the United States. October 2nd, 1964 came in, and there was a big rally at Cairo High School football field. And Cairo supplied its own Goldwater girls. Less recognizable, his image as well as perhaps his name, but this is John C. Breckinridge. He was vice president under James Buchanan, and he was the Southern Democrat. The Democrat Party split in 1860, Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats. He was the Southern Democrats' candidate for president. He visited Cairo, and the Cairo newspaper said he was given a hearty reception and farewell. The Sons of Malta, which was an organization kind of like the Masons, got their flags and their cannon out, and he made the occasion a very lively one. Mr. Breckinridge is a fine-looking, sociable young man of about 38 years. He made a short address returning thanks for the demonstration. This poor guy ran for president. I think he wanted to be president more than Stephen A. Douglas wanted to be president. He ran and got the Democrat Party's nomination 3 different times, lost 3 times as president. This is William Jennings Bryan. He visited Cairo actually on 3 different occasions because he was running for president 3 different times. He's also known, if you don't know him from your high school or college history class, if you've ever seen the movie Inherit the Wind about the Scopes trial, William Jennings Bryan was volunteered his services to prosecute Mr. Scopes for teaching or mentioning evolution in the public classroom in Tennessee. And Clarence Darrow, who was the attorney for Scopes, called William Jennings Bryan to the stand because he was a Sunday school teacher. And he was called to the stand as an expert on the creation story as it appeared in the Bible. And from all accounts, Darrow pretty much embarrassed William Jennings Bryan, who got very nervous with his facts and kind of got tangled up. I would be surprised if you can mention this guy or know who this guy is from his picture, and maybe not even from his name. But this is Eugene Debs. And Eugene Debs ran for president 5 different times. He ran in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920. He was the socialist candidate for president. What surprises people, not that the Socialist Party had a candidate, what surprises people, in 1912, he received 6% of the popular vote in this country. He didn't get any electoral college votes, but 6% of the popular vote is pretty good. The other thing about him running for president, when he ran in 1920, he was in federal prison. and he ran from prison. He visited Cairo in 1906, and this is what the Cairo paper said about him. Mr. Debs is a good speaker, earnest and forceful, and punctuates his remarks by quotations and illustrations, which make him easy to follow. He painted a woeful picture of the condition of affairs in all walks of life, which he said was due to, quote, the system. And he gave socialism as the panacea for all of the country's ills. His hearers were interested in his address, even if they did not agree with his doctrine. Anybody recognize this guy? Okay, so we're going to put politicians aside for a while and look at authors. This is Charles Dickens, author of Oliver Twist, Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Tale of Two Cities, my personal favorite book, and lots of other classics in literature. In April 1842, he came to the United States, and he came to Cairo on April 9th, 1842. And he was on a riverboat steamer going down the Ohio River, and they pulled into Cairo for about 3 or 4 hours. So he was there for just a short time. And this is his impression of Cairo, which was then published all over the world in one of Dickens' books. He said, Cairo is a breeding place of fever, ague, and death, a place without one single quality in earth or air or water to commend it. Such is this dismal Cairo. 1842, Cairo had no brick buildings. The buildings that it had were up on stilts. It was kind of swampland behind the town or settlement. And then people have speculated Cairo was well known because millions of dollars were invested from British financiers in the Cairo scheme. And then here Dickens, who knew about those investments and knew about companies in London going bankrupt from losing money from investing in Cairo. And then what did he see? It probably wouldn't have impressed us much either if we had seen it in 1842. What people don't know and why they don't talk about this, because lots of people talk about Dickens' comments about Cairo, was that in 1867 he revisited the United States and he was invited to come to Cairo. And he spoke in Cairo at the Athenaeum, which was basically a theater, on February 3rd, 1868. And when he accepted the invitation, he showed up and read from his books, excerpts from his writing. He said that he would, quote, make an ample amend for all the damage I may have done to Cairo in the past. But people never mention his 1867 visit to Cairo. It's more fun to talk about the dismal swamp. This guy is closely associated with Cairo, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. And Mark Twain visited in 1859, 1861, and then in 1882. He, of course, is the author of Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, and he's a riverboat, or was a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi River, traveling between St. Louis and New Orleans. His first known visit to Cairo was about 1859, and his last visit that's documented is in 1882. One of the people that was, we would call them a deckhand today, on the riverboat was Sam Clemens or Mark Twain. They were called mates back then, but his name was Grant Marsh, and he went on to become a kind of legendary steamboat captain himself. But this is what he said about Mark Twain. He said, Sam was one of the nicest behaved young men I ever saw, but a poor pilot never turned a wheel. I know he actually went threadbare for months at a time in order to send money to his mother and sister, whom he supported. He was too nice to ever be a pilot. Now, when I first read that, I thought Mr. Marsh was saying that he wasn't a very good pilot. And everybody, by all accounts, he was an excellent pilot. And then when I read it again, what he meant was that he was in poverty. He was threadbare because he was sending all of his money back to his mother, who he was supporting. So when he said he was a poor pilot, didn't mean that he was poor at his job. It just meant that he was in poverty. He came to Cairo again in 1882, and he wrote this about Cairo. He said, "Cairo is a brisk town now and is substantially built and has a city look about it, which is noticeably in contrast to its former estate, as per Mr. Dickens' portrait of it. However, it was already building with bricks when I last had seen it, and that would have been in 1861, which was when Colonel Grant was drilling his command there. Cairo has a heavy railroad and river trade, and her situations at the junction of the two rivers is so advantageous that she cannot help but prosper." Anybody know who this is? Nope. This is, hopefully you remember the name or recognize the name. This is Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes was a poet, a writer, a playwright, and he is seen as one of the best examples of the Harlem Renaissance. So he was from New York, but he moved to Chicago, and he said, "I was just curious about Cairo. I'd heard about it in a song, and I was just kind of curious what Cairo was like." And so he got on the train and came to Cairo, and he met this young man, high school student, on the train, who then took him home, introduced him to his high school teachers, and took him around and showed him Cairo. One of the places that Langston Hughes wanted to see was the home of David Lanston. And David Lanston was a white attorney who was involved in the efforts to desegregate Cairo schools. And people that resisted that desegregation, a neighbor put a red neon sign, an arrow, pointing at the house of David Lanston, so that, quote, they would know where to throw the dynamite. And Langston Hughes said, well, we drove by, they were taking him back to the train station, and he wanted to see the house and sign. They drove by, and somebody zipped around them in a white car and threw a rock at the house and window of David Lanston, and then sped off. And David Langston Hughes said, came out screaming and yelling, thinking they had thrown the rock. And then he recognized some people in the car and realized that it hadn't been them. All right, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery. He became a freedom seeker on the Underground Railroad, was successful, later became a conductor himself on the Underground Railroad, and became probably the best known abolitionist lecturer in the years before the Civil War. He wrote a book called the Autobiography of Frederick Douglass, which I always read each year with my high school students. And then he also was the ambassador to Haiti. People don't know about Frederick Douglass coming to Cairo, Illinois, but he came to Cairo, Illinois 3 times. He came to Cairo and spoke for the first time in February 1867 at the Athenaeum, which was a theater in Cairo. And this is what the Cairo paper said about his visit. The Republicans of Cairo owe it to themselves and their party to give their distinguished champion and leader a reception worthy the man and the great hour that brings him among them. Among the radical leaders of Southern Illinois, Frederick Douglass stands up a very giant in intellect and decency, and we bespeak for him a full house and respectful hearing. Of course, that was a Republican newspaper, and the Republican Party at that time was very much in favor of civil rights for African Americans. He also was expected back in Cairo July 31st, 1874. He was coming from Washington, D.C., accompanied by Governor Pinchback, who was the first black governor to be elected from the state of Louisiana. And then he was invited for his third visit by the Cairo AME Church. And he was asked to come during the Christmas holidays and lecture in 1876. And they were hoping they could sell tickets when he came, and then the money that they raised could be used to get the church out of debt. The lecture was postponed until January 1877, however. Anybody recognize the name Edna Ferber? No. Edna Ferber won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for a book she wrote called So Big. And then she also wrote a novel called Showboat, which they then made into a movie or a film. And you've probably seen the movie Showboat if you watch old movies. When she wrote Showboat, Edna Ferber stayed in Cairo, Illinois to do research. And the movie mentions Cairo in a couple places, but if you read the book Showboat by Edna Ferber, she mentions Cairo quite a bit throughout the novel, and Thebes, Illinois. Matter of fact, she mentions Thebes, Illinois more than she mentions Cairo, Illinois. Recognize Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, came to Cairo on two different occasions. He came in 1868, just happened to be stopping on a riverboat trip, and then he came back in 1881. And when he came back in 1881, he said this was reported in the newspaper by the editor or reporter. In bidding me goodbye, he gave me his card and requested me to make some inquiry regarding one of his old servants. That's kind of a code word for enslaved person. One of his old servants that was living in Cairo. He speaks very feelingly of this old woman and expressed a regret that he could not keep her and take care of her in her old age. Her name is Betsy Younger, and I have learned that she died in the city of Cairo not long ago in extreme poverty. This will be sad news for the good old man Jefferson Davis, for such I regard him to be. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through some of these. Susan B. Anthony spoke in Cairo at the Athenaeum on February 27th, 1877. She spoke about what she called the 16th Amendment. She was hoping the 20th Amendment would be ratified much sooner than it was and would become the 16th Amendment. Elizabeth Cady Stanton visited November 12, 1870. She, of course, is the person that organized the Seneca Falls Convention in New York and was president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She spoke in Cairo, also at the Athenaeum Theater, and she was supposed to come back in 1879, and she was up in St. Louis, and she got better offers, bigger crowds. And she was with Susan B. Anthony, and Susan B. Anthony wrote back to the people at Cairo, included a $10 bill, and says, sorry for the inconvenience, but we have a better offer, and hopefully this $10 will cover any losses that you might have. Ida B. Wells Barnett. And she was the leading crusader against lynchings in the United States, and also was one of the founders of the NAACP. She came to Cairo in 1909 to investigate the lynching of Froggy James. She stayed the night at 612 12th Street in Cairo. That's now a vacant lot. The house is no longer there. And she also addressed a meeting at St. Michael's Episcopal Church Hall, which was at 418 14th Street in Cairo, also no longer there, I believe. She made a second trip back to Cairo in 1924 at the height of Ku Klux Klan recruitment in Pulaski and Alexander counties. Mother Jones. Mother Jones came February 22nd, 1905, probably best known for organizing labor, especially coal miners, and even more known probably for efforts to end child labor. Carrie Nation carried the hatchet, would go into towns unannounced, go into the saloon with other women, take her hatchet, and just destroy the place. She described herself as, quote, a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like. She spoke at the park in Cairo called Washington Park. I think that's the place where the Hewer, if you're familiar with Cairo, the Hewer statue is located. And she spoke there and she said this at Cairo: I have been in jail 25 times. I have stripes made from lashes from whips on my back. And I have a wrist that was once broken. She was a hard woman to scare. And she left Cairo after she gave a talk about the liquor industry in Cairo, which was a big part of the city. She snuck back in a couple days later, went back to the same park, and gave a speech against tobacco. Thurgood Marshall, first African American to be appointed to the United States Supreme Court. They began a lawsuit in Cairo in 1941. Black teachers sued for equal pay to white teachers, which was the federal law and which was the state law. And Thurgood Marshall was the NAACP attorney, and he was sent to Cairo for that case. One of the black teachers was a woman named Hattie Kendrick. And when Thurgood Marshall came to Cairo, this is what she recalled. She said, quote, Thurgood and this other attorney were being called boys by the defense attorney. He went on about how only a brilliant attorney, like the one who had won a case like this in Tennessee, could win this one. And after he finished, Thurgood got up, bowed to him, thanked him, saying, quote, I am that qualified, brilliant attorney who handled that case. And the whole courtroom burst into laughter. Thurgood Marshall won his case. Black teachers were paid equally with white teachers. Congressman John Lewis. He was a freedom rider, co-founder of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. He was one of the leaders of the march from Selma to Montgomery and was beaten during Bloody Sunday in that march in 1965. He came to Cairo as a young man in 1962 for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And in 1962, he spent the summer, he did training sessions at Ward Chapel AME Church in Cairo. And then there was a famous photograph that you can still purchase online that shows him doing a prayer vigil. He's kneeling down, and then there are other young people kneeling down beside him in prayer. And it's labeled, it's outside the segregated swimming pool in Cairo. And I've been informed that that picture was taken in Cairo, but it wasn't outside the swimming pool. It was actually taken outside of City Hall in Cairo. He also was arrested at one of the restaurants in Cairo and taken away and put in jail. Wild Bill Buffalo Cody came in 1882 with, quote, a troop comprising a band of real Indians, and he presented a play on the stage at the Cairo Opera House in 1882. And the last one, music lovers, this is John Philip Sousa, well known as a composer and conductor. Probably best known work is The Stars and the Stripes Forever. He came twice to Cairo, performed both times with his concert at the Cairo Opera House. So why were so many, and that's just some of them, less than half, why did so many famous people come to Cairo? So Cairo had the confluence. That's where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers come together. And travelers on the rivers would have stopped at Cairo. And at least for the first part of the 1800s, people came to Cairo in large part because of its location. The riverfront at Cairo welcomed people. It was easy to get off actually, if you got off at Cairo, you didn't get off on the Mississippi side, you would have gotten off on the Ohio side. So if you were coming down the Mississippi, your boat would have to make that turn and get off at the Cairo wharf. There also were a half dozen major railroads in the second part of the 1800s that passed through Cairo. And the same thing if you were traveling to a faraway city in Chicago or even going from the west to New York, you might have passed through Cairo. And some of these people are just noted as coming to Cairo on a train. And the newspaper editor found out about it, and he noted that in the paper that so-and-so was at Cairo on the train. But 6 major railroads converged at Cairo. But you have to have comfortable venue for people to speak or performers to perform. And Cairo had very early on what's called the Athenaeum, that a lot of people have maybe never heard of before. But it was on the east side of Commercial Avenue, close to 7th Street in Cairo, and it was built as a place where Civil War soldiers could go for amusement. And the Athenaeum attracted and became the venue for lots of well-known speakers who would come into Cairo to give lectures or perform. So it wasn't just for vaudeville or traveling performers. It also had the Cairo Opera House, which is the picture in the center. It was opened in 1881 and remained open and in operation until it burned in 1947. There also were large churches like AME Ward Chapel Church here, where people, especially during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, were welcomed into the church. And then Magnolia Manor at the top, well known to lots of people. If you're curious about the sources for this, I'll be glad to give you specific sources if you just send me an email. Most of this comes from newspaper accounts, but also secondary sources, county and state or county and city histories that were written. And I'm just going to go very quickly, take a minute or less to go through and show you the ones that didn't necessarily make the cut for today. Admiral George Dewey, Francis Willard, Temperance Movement, John Ross on the Cherokee Trail of Tears. He actually stopped in Cairo. He and his family took the trip by riverboat rather than walking or in wagons. Aaron Burr, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark stayed for several days in 1803, and his brother, George Rogers Clark, was told to build a fort at the confluence. Well, he built it on the Kentucky side, Fort Jefferson. William Tecumseh Sherman, of course, locally famous John A. Logan, John James Audubon, Casey Jones, Mary Livermore, Civil War nurse, Frank James came in 1904, Cole Younger, 1909, Emmett Till coming from Chicago to visit his grandfather, and then his body was also passed through Cairo when he was returned in 1955. Adlai Stevenson, Joseph Cannon, most powerful speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives ever. Sam Houston, Peter Cartwright, Methodist evangelist. William Walker, fascinating guy. Most people don't know who he is, but Edwin Booth, brother of John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln. Louis Armstrong, B.B. King, Otis Redding, Sam Cooke, James Milton Turner, Wade Hampton, Julian Bond, Angela Davis, Ralph Abernathy, Al Capone, Charlotte Cushman, Faye Templeton, Sissy Retta Jones, known as the Black Patti. She was a soprano opera singer. George Winter, Alexander Maximilian, George C. Eggleston, and Dr. Leonidas Berry. Billy Sunday, J.P. Morgan. Well, I kept you longer than I expected by about 10 minutes, but if you have questions, you can ask them or you can see me later, and I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Okay, we had one question on Zoom. I was born and raised in Cairo, and I've always wondered if an underground railroad route or station existed.
Yes. As a matter of fact, it's been designated officially by the National Park Service as a site for the Underground Railroad. And that just recently happened, I think within the month. But there was a porter on the Illinois Central Railroad named George L. Burroughs, and his work on the Underground Railroad is pretty well documented and was accepted. So there was, that would have been in the mid-1850s, there was an Underground Railroad station or activity in Cairo. Any questions from?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I got here late, and I'm curious if you already spoke to the reason why the funds that were sent from London, like why the buildup didn't happen.
I don't know much about it, except every account I read said corruption. Yeah. Because the money was invested, and then it didn't get to Cairo. And people had great dreams. Here is a site right between the Ohio and Mississippi River. We can drain the city, build a canal that would go across. And they got people in London especially to invest in that. But the money never made it to Cairo, Illinois. the town of Cairo was blamed by at least Charles Dickens. As a matter of fact, one of his novels called The Adventures of something Chuzzlewit talks about Cairo and talks about the scandal over the investment, but he doesn't use the name Cairo. He names the town Eden. So if you ever read that novel and come across Eden, he's talking about his idea of Cairo. The Adventures, I think it's called The Life and Adventures of, I can't remember the first name, but the last name is Chuzzlewit. Chuzzlewit. Charles Dickens, yes. All right, thank you again. Appreciate it.
Members, we will have a short business meeting in the room up here. So if you can meet us up there so we can get that. Yep. And thank you to